November 29, 1943, just past noon over Bremen, Germany. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran crouched in the tail section of a B-17 flying fortress named Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, watching German fighters swarm toward his bomber through frozen air at 24,000 feet, where temperatures had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. He was 19 years old, a farm boy from Wisconsin on his first combat mission, manning the loneliest position on the aircraft, where tail gunners sat separated from their crew by 40 feet of fuselage, with nothing but twin 50-caliber machine guns between them and death. Within the next 15 minutes, Moran's bomber would be literally torn in half by enemy fire at 4.5 miles altitude, and he would ride the severed tail section down through 24,000 feet of empty sky, while doing something so insane that German pilots would scatter in disbelief. He kept firing his machine guns at enemy fighters while falling to certain death, shooting at Germans from spinning wreckage, and somehow he would survive the impact to become one of only 3 Allied airmen in World War II to fall 4 miles without a parachute and live. Before we dive into exactly how Moran survived what should have killed him instantly, like this video because it helps us share more forgotten stories like this one, and subscribe if you haven't already because we're covering the moments when survival defied every law of physics. Let's get back to that frozen November morning when Eugene Moran was about to experience the most terrifying 15 minutes any human being could survive. The mission had started badly and gotten worse with every mile deeper into German airspace. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi had taken off from England that morning as part of the 96th Bomb Group, joining hundreds of flying fortresses targeting Bremen, one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. By November 1943, the survival numbers were brutal. Crews had to complete 25 missions to go home, but the average crew lasted only 15 missions, and some bomb groups were losing half their aircraft every month. The formations crossed the North Sea and penetrated German airspace, flying straight and level because maneuvering would ruin the bomb run, making them perfect targets for hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. Moran watched from his tail position as a B-17 ahead took a direct flak hit, folded in half, and dropped from the sky, with no parachutes because the crew died instantly. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi released its bombs over the target and began the turn toward England, with 200 miles of hostile airspace still ahead. That's when a German flak shell hit the number 2 engine, and the bomber began losing speed, falling behind the protective formation. A damaged bomber falling behind was a death sentence because German fighter pilots hunted stragglers, and a lone B-17 was easy prey. Moran saw them coming, at least a dozen Messerschmitts climbing from below, and Focke-Wulfs diving from above. The first attack came from directly behind, where only the tail gunner could engage, and Moran squeezed the triggers, sending tracer rounds toward the German fighter. The Messerschmitt broke off, but there were more, many more, and the Focke-Wulfs attacked in coordinated pairs. Moran swung his guns from target to target as brass casings piled around his knees, and the smell of cordite filled the tail compartment. His fingers went numb despite his heated flight suit, while the machine guns grew hot from continuous firing. The Germans knew exactly how to kill a B-17. Target the engines first, then eliminate the gunners, then pour cannon fire into the fuselage until something vital broke. Moran heard impacts, the sound of 20mm shells punching through aluminum, and somewhere forward, the waist gunners stopped firing, which meant they were dead or wounded. He just kept firing because there was nothing else he could do. A Focke-Wulf came in from the side, and Moran pressed the triggers. The fighter's wing disintegrated, and it spiraled downward, trailing smoke, his first confirmed kill. But cannon rounds were ripping through the tail section, and Moran felt something slam into his left forearm, and then his right. Both arms had been hit, and blood soaked through his flight suit. The pain was intense, but his hands still worked, so he kept firing as more impacts tore through the aircraft and control cables snapped above him. He glanced down at his parachute and saw holes, multiple holes where cannon rounds had shredded the silk canopy. If he had to bail out, he would fall 4 miles to his death because his parachute was destroyed. The attack continued as German fighters made pass after pass on the crippled bomber. Forward in the nose, navigator Jesse Orison was still alive but wounded. The pilot and co-pilot dead at the controls. The flight engineer dead. The radio operator dead. The ball turret gunner dead. The waist gunners dead. Of the 10 men who'd taken off that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Then came the sound Moran would never forget, the shriek of tearing aluminum as Rikki-Tikki-Tavi broke apart. The fuselage split just forward of the tail section, and Moran watched the front of the aircraft fall away, wings and engines and cockpit of the crewmates tumbling toward Earth 4.5 miles below. He was alone now, trapped in a severed tail section with a destroyed parachute and wounded arms, falling through 24,000 feet of empty sky. The tail section tumbled end over end, throwing Moran against the walls as blood sprayed across the interior. The wind howled through the torn fuselage, and Moran had perhaps 90 seconds to live. He should have been paralyzed with fear, should have waited for death, but instead he did something that defied all logic. He grabbed his machine guns and started firing at the German fighters still circling. Tracers arced wildly through the sky as the tail section spun and the German pilots scattered because they had never seen anything like this, a man in falling wreckage firing back at them. One Messerschmitt took hits and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke. The ground rushed up, fields and forests and roads, but the tail section's aerodynamics were saving his life. The stabilizers acted like crude wings, creating drag, and instead of plummeting straight down, the wreckage began to glide. Moran was still falling at approximately 100 feet per second, fast enough to kill on impact, but slower than free fall. He braced himself against the steel chest plate and wrapped his wounded arms around ammunition boxes. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at 100 miles per hour. The impact snapped branches, the vertical stabilizer tore away, and the wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy. Moran's head slammed into steel framework, his ribs cracked, both arms bent at impossible angles, and the tail section crashed into frozen ground. Then silence. Eugene Moran was alive, barely. Both forearms broken, with bone protruding through skin, ribs shattered, blood pouring from his head, where skull had been torn away, exposing brain tissue. He was 15 miles inside enemy territory, surrounded by Germans who just watched American bombs destroy their factories. He crawled from the wreckage onto concrete floor, where he was left for 2 days with no doctor, no water, no morphine. His wounds became infected, the exposed brain tissue swelled, his arms turned black as gangrene set in. Without surgery, he had 48 hours to live. On the 3rd day, he was transported to a POW hospital, where Serbian doctors captured on the Eastern Front examined him and decided to try saving him. The surgery lasted 7 hours with almost no anesthesia as they set his bones with metal pins, cleaned infected tissue, removed skull fragments, and attached a metal plate to his head. They told him the next 72 hours would determine if he lived or died. The fever came that night, climbing to 104 degrees with violent chills. The second night he slipped into delirium, screaming for dead crewmates. But on the 3rd morning the fever broke. He was alive. Recovery took months, but Moran survived to spend 17 months as a prisoner of war, including the brutal Black March in early 1945, when thousands of Allied airmen were forced to walk 600 miles across Germany in winter.
He walked those miles with a body that never fully healed, the metal plate in his skull conducting freezing cold into his brain, watching men die around him daily. But Eugene Moran kept walking because he hadn't survived a 4-mile fall to die on a frozen road. On April 26, 1945, American soldiers intercepted the column near the Elbe River, and the prisoners were free. Moran weighed 93 pounds, having lost 40% of his body weight, but he was alive. He returned to Wisconsin, married, raised 9 children, and rarely spoke about the war for 60 years. In 2007, Wisconsin created the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award and chose Moran as the first recipient. In 2008, his town named a street after him. Eugene Moran died March 23, 2014, at age 89, 7 decades after he kept firing his machine guns while falling 4 miles through the sky.
If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. You're part of keeping these memories alive, and thank you for making sure Eugene Moran doesn't disappear into silence, because these men deserve to be remembered.